Second chapter of Corinthians now. And the general theme of this chapter is encouraging, again, in forgiveness this time. So, after continuing to apologize for his personal fickleness and asking for their forgiveness, Paul then insists on them forgiving their fellow Corinthians as well. Forgiving those who also caused them grief, forgiving both him and them, so that they might be a pleasing aroma to God, verse 15. Since God was often associated with the pleasing aroma of forgiveness in the Jewish culture. There was a pleasing aroma inside the tent of meeting. And this pleasing aroma also wafted out into among the Jews. This pleasing aroma came from an altar about this size, about this tall, about these dimensions. And that on this aroma, they would burn incense.
On this altar.
Pardon me?
On this altar.
On this altar, they would burn incense. And so there would be a bowl, with a fire underneath a bowl, the coals underneath a bowl, and it would evaporate this incense into the air. It would be wafting all over. And this was a pretty special incense, very, very special incense. It had a special formula that God gave. It was a formula of equal parts of 4 different oils, 1 or 2 of which are not available anymore. Whether they disappeared because certain plant disappeared, when they disappeared, possibly disappeared when the temple disappeared. So, this special aroma was very prominent in the Jewish culture, and this is probably what Paul is referring to when he speaks of an aroma. And this altar was gold covered and pretty much the same dimension as the Ark of the Covenant. You may remember the Ark of the Covenant was a box a little bit bigger on which those stone tablets were placed inside of. And then there were those gold angels on top that you may recall from Luke last year, chocolate bunnies, whatever we had, and the mercy seat on top. And this altar of incense was placed in front of the curtain, shielding that Ark of the Covenant. So this aroma would rise up in front of that curtain, which was shielding the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, yeah. And so, this Ark, of course, they all recognized as being where their forgiveness started. You made sacrifices outside of this tent. And, of course, this was a tent without a tent top. So that aroma would drift all around. You would smell that forgiveness from your sacrifices. And Paul did indeed need forgiveness. If there was anything to forgive, he says in verse 10. He did need this grief that he caused to be overlooked, even if his apology was somewhat qualified. Yeah, it was somewhat qualified with that it was in your best interest excuse of verse 23 of last chapter. And it is now qualified with a God led me that way. God led me that way excuse in verse 14 of this chapter. After all, Paul did let his fickle emotions drive him 250 miles northward, 400 clicks northward, to Troas to find his buddy Titus, in all likelihood, rather than taking a boat directly to Corinth to see them first, as Paul had suggested earlier in Corinthians 1:15. Yet Paul admits to Corinth of changing his mind of letting his emotions drive him onward and upward, way past Troas as well. Drive him the far longer route overland through Macedonia, since his dear brother Titus was going that way. Titus was tripping overland through the territory of Macedonia, following a task assigned to him by Paul, which we see suggested in verses 13, and we will see in chapter 16 of, as you have seen in chapter 16 of our previous letter. His dear brother Titus. Yeah, who's this Titus character? This Titus character, who we have previously shown, was affectionately known as Timothy. There's some indication of that, as I've proven prior. However, Paul uses the official name, brother Titus, his birth name, in this chapter, as opposed to the affectionate nickname of Timothy, used in verse 19 of the previous chapter. He uses the official name in order to suggest more of an official dealing with Titus. Yes, with respect to the official collection that brother Titus was making for Jerusalem throughout Macedonia. Perhaps indicating Paul's fickle concern for Titus getting ripped off in his travels throughout Macedonia, according to our commentator Harris. So, Paul needed the forgiveness of those in Corinth, those that he gave false testimony to. And here it seems that at least one other guy living in Corinth needed their forgiveness as well. Forgiveness for a certain sin, for a very specific sin. Which begs the operative question, exactly what sin are we talking about in Corinth? There's so many. Which is a question that many contemporary commentators refuse to speculate on. Whereas the more courageous Calvin suggests that it was that incestuous guy mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:1. That guy having sex with his stepmother. Yeah. It seems Calvin was awfully big on sex. In fact, Calvin reformed the entire Western world on sex, marriage, and family life. Few people know that. You go to Amazon, find a book, hit on the hyperlink, you'll find a book defending that. However, that's a reformation that insignificant others are now taking pride for having made. Or, number two, there's another commentator cited by Guthrie who speculates that it may have been that Lyticus guy of 1 Corinthians 6, verse 1. That guy taking his brother to civil court, likely over his rightful inheritance that had been wrongfully proportioned. Or number three, one woman cited by Guthrie speculates that it was about a guy who had stolen money from the collection that Paul was so anxious about. Money that Titus was supposed to collect for Jerusalem and would not now go to Jerusalem. However, verses 5 and 10 suggest otherwise. They suggest a generic anyone rather than a guy, and not necessarily a sin either, but rather a grief caused by anyone, with our primary commentators, Harris and Guthrie, suggesting that this was some grief against Paul personally, a slander against Paul himself, or a slander of Paul's beliefs. So, allow me to be as courageous as Calvin here. Allow me to speculate on that specific grief then. To that end, I will speculate that those Corinthians were attacking Paul's doctrine of the physical resurrection of the dead. Physical. Just as those folks down the street in Athens were attacking Paul's resurrection of the dead doctrine in Acts 17, verse 32. A resurrection alluded to a couple more times in this letter in chapters 5 and 13. In particular, attacking the physical resurrection of unbelievers that we mentioned earlier in chapter 15. Since the resurrection to hell is awfully offensive to unbelievers for some reason. An attack on Paul's natural argument of the resurrection of all seeds planted in the ground. All seeds. But especially an attack on Paul's hostile argument of this allegedly unknown God that will judge the entire world, all people, everywhere, Paul says in Acts, or Luke says in Acts, well, Paul said it, everywhere, Paul said in Acts 17, that God will judge them in righteousness, a judgment that demands both eternal reward and eternal punishment. So, in that respect, those skeptics that had previously insisted that there is no resurrection of the body should also be forgiven, and that even they should be admitted into the church, as Paul suggests in verses 7 and 8. But only following repentance and rehabilitation, of course. Otherwise, they could hardly be considered Christian, and otherwise there would be no peace among the brethren in a properly Christian church. Brethren that strongly insist on a physical resurrection of Christ, which was the creed that we suggested in chapter 15. And brethren that strongly insist on the proper justice of God. Nor would there be peace among long deceased brethren. Yeah, brethren who are already dead, who continue to insist on justice as well, as we read in Revelation 6, verse 10. There's an often neglected verse. Those brethren in heaven that remain anxious for him who leads justice to victory, as mentioned in Matthew 12:20. Brethren anxious for a glorious victory parade with real rather than virtual bodies. Brethren anxious for the triumphal procession, now alluded to by Paul in verse 14. A concept understood from a typical victory parade in Corinth and parades throughout the Roman world. A parade of the victor leading the soldiers and the emancipated slaves through the streets, as well as parading many still alive yet conquered enemies through the public streets. A parade not only to display those that were saved, but also to make a proper display of those that they were saved from, making it a far more glorious display. It was a parade typically accompanied by smells and bells, yes. Pleasing smells and bells to reinforce the concept of their glorious victory. Just as this altar, the incense from this altar reinforced the concept of their victory. And moreover, more so, the victory over sin and death. Victory won by Christ. Father, we thank you for sending Christ to win that victory for us. May we be a pleasing aroma to you as a result. Amen.